Hey there, Psychonauts! So today I'm going to talk about my recent experience smoking DMT at the peak of a mushroom trip. Now, I was on around 2.5 grams of mushrooms, so about half a heroic dose, and I'll just jump right into the experience. It was close to the peak of the mushroom experience, and I'm laying in my bed under the blankets, and I'm just listening. I'm listening to the mushroom sounds, and I remember it feeling like I was trying to tune in to this frequency that was going to transport me to some sort of tryptamine mental dimension. This is what it felt like. I felt like I was already approaching hyperspace in a way, and I remember wanting sensory deprivation. I was way too distracted by everything else going on. I also had company, but the sensory deprivation wasn't going to happen, so I thought maybe the DMT could nudge me in the right direction. So setting up this DMT trip while peaking on mushrooms was quite the task. It's like a whole process trying to find it, trying to weigh it out. I ended up not weighing it out and just said F it last minute, but I did load up like a typical sub-breakthrough dose. I remember I was just shaking the whole time that I'm getting ready for the DMT. It's like my mind and body just knows what's coming. But I eventually get it set up, and then I go back in bed, get comfortable again, and I meditate for a while before I go for the DMT. And so, I'm like closing my eyes and just meditating. And I remember it gets kind of trippy when I get close to that moment of decision. Like that moment that I decide that, yes, I'm going to smoke the DMT. Like, it's time. I don't know, something strange happens. Anyway, so I have the DMT ready. I am comfortable in my bed. I am still shaking even after taking some time to meditate and breathe and calm myself down beforehand. I still can't stop shaking before I go in for this DMT. Now, my plan is to go in for just one big as I can hit and hold it in for as long as I can. It was already difficult enough setting up the DMT, and I knew it was going to be difficult actually smoking it. So yeah, I was just going for one big hit, and I was just gonna see what it did, see if it pushed me further into the tryptamine realms that I was already exploring. So I take my big hit, hold it in, let go, and blast off. But the thing is, it didn't really feel like a blast off. I mean, I didn't take a breakthrough dose. I did take a sub-breakthrough dose, but really the mushrooms were like blurring the edges of the experience. It made the come up much more smooth, and it kind of felt like less of an event than it usually does when I'm sober. So yeah, this come up was much smoother. I just remember the DMT hitting me and just feeling the DMT feeling, which is hard to describe if you've never been there, but it's a very familiar feeling. It always provokes this sense in me of like, I'm just like trying to understand something. The visuals obviously intensified, and I remember looking at something on my ceiling, these like morphine coiling type visuals, and they kind of moved with my mind. Like the more I became curious about them, the more they were like, oh, I can do this. Are you more curious? Let's do this. But other than that, it was really hard to remember the trip. But I don't know what else you would expect with a trip within a trip, because trips are already hard to remember, especially DMT trips. So a DMT trip nested within a mushroom trip is even harder to remember. It was just a smoother experience overall, and there wasn't this drastic shift in consciousness that, usually happens when you're sober and you go to DMT hyperspace. There's this big drastic shift in consciousness. But like I said, I was like already there. I was already like listening to that frequency that I could hear on the mushrooms, and I also noticed that with DMT. So I was already like flirting with hyperspace before I even got to this experience. But like I said, it wasn't a full breakthrough dose. The calm down was hard to distinguish, and overall, I feel like the DMT acted like a catalyst for the rest of my mushroom experience. It definitely enhanced the experience, and I think even after the DMT had faded, it added to the mushroom experience. What I took away from this trip is being reminded of a quote, and I won't say the whole quote right now because I did not write it down, but the start of it goes, the reason it's so confounding is because the thing trying to look at the DMT is infected by it, by the process of inspection. So it's like by looking at the DMT, by trying to like understand the DMT in a way, or like the thing that is understanding the DMT is infected by it. I don't know, it's a Terence McKenna quote and I was instantly reminded of it after this trip. Another thing I wrote about this trip, and this is one of the last things that I really remember, is I noticed that the experience was sort of a reflection of my own thoughts and perceptions. Like when I go into the experience with a sense of like profound curiosity, it seems like the experience builds off of that. Like the experience builds off of itself. Like you're initially infected with the DMT, and then you look at the experience, and then the next thing that you do, your next perception, causes like a chain reaction in the DMT experience, and it's like the experience builds off of itself, and it definitely builds off of like what you give it. And I noticed that when I give the DMT curiosity, that leads to my best experiences. If you ever get into like fear, and I've done it in the past where I've gotten into fear trips, the trip turns into like a fear trip and it builds off of that. So yeah, and I remember being curious about the fact that DMT is endogenous, and I remember being hung up on that and thinking about it like after I came down from the DMT. I was like, it's so interesting that it's endogenous. And I was just really trying to understand what it is that DMT does, like from the subjective internal perspective. I was just like, what was that? Like, what is it? And I feel like that a lot during DMT. But yeah, overall, it was a good trip, and I felt like I could have done more. I almost always feel like I could have done more after smoking DMT. And I did decide to go back for one more time. This time I think I got less DMT than I did the first time. But yeah, I did go back in for one more. There was really nothing spectacular about the second trip. There was one interesting thing, but yeah, it's not for this video because I talked about it in my last video actually. But other than that, the second trip was almost a repeat of the first one, just maybe a little bit less intense. But yeah, that was what it was like smoking DMT at the peak of an acid trip. It was very hard to remember. It was a smoother experience overall, and the DMT acted as a catalyst for the rest of the mushroom experience. Overall, I enjoyed it. I would try it again, and if I do try it again, I'd be interested to try it on either a higher dose of mushrooms or a higher dose of DMT, or maybe both. We will see. Yeah, so let me know if you have any experiences combining DMT and mushrooms, or just any thoughts on DMT and mushrooms in general, and you all will see me in the next video.